Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, we're diving right in today, straight onto a bustling street corner in Sarajevo. The date? June 28th, 1914. We're going to unpack the true origins of a global conflict that literally reshaped the modern world as we know it.
Imagine just standing on that corner. Out of nowhere, a 19-year-old student pulls a gun and assassinates the prince of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It's wild to think about, right? This one single, isolated moment is the exact event historians credit with triggering a brutal 4-year war that wiped ancient, powerful empires completely off the map. And the horrific human toll of that trigger? Over 20 million lives lost. 20 million. We call it World War I. Honestly, it's just a staggering, almost incomprehensible figure stemming from what happened on one single afternoon. But we really have to ask ourselves, does it sound just a bit too sensational to claim that a single teenager caused all of this? Like, if we went back in a time machine and stopped him, would this entire global catastrophe have been avoided? Well, the reality is a whole lot more complex.
To really get a grip on this, I want you to think of the assassination as a tiny matchstick. Just a tiny matchstick striking against a massive mountain of dynamite that was already sitting there waiting to explode. If I strike a match and the mountain blows up, the blast didn't happen just because of my match, right? It happened because the dynamite was already stacked miles high. So let's uncover the real reasons the world exploded in 1914.
Let's start with Section 1, Europe's Imperial Map. The world in 1914 looked totally different than it does today. I mean, you wouldn't even find Poland on the map. The landscape was dominated by these sprawling empires, the Austro-Hungarian, German, Russian, and Ottoman. And almost all of these were monarchies ruled by powerful kings. Across the entire continent, only France, Switzerland, and San Marino actually functioned as democracies. That's it.
So our story really heats up in the Balkans. Back in 1878, after a war, a treaty gave the Austro-Hungarian Empire the right to temporarily manage Bosnia. But 30 years later, in 1908, the Austrians basically said, actually, we're done managing, we're just going to outright annex it.
Well, as you can imagine, the locals were absolutely furious. They wanted independence, not a brand new master. And their neighbors in Serbia? They were completely enraged too, because they shared this really deep ethnic connection as South Slavs. This Austrian annexation directly threatened their revolutionary dream of building a united nation called Yugoslavia.
Which brings us to Section 2, the chain of friendship.
This local fury quickly activated a massive geopolitical tripwire. Look at how this unfolded in 3 disastrous steps. It actually started with a secret backdoor deal. Russia initially agreed to let Austria take Bosnia, provided Austria helped Russia gain control of a highly strategic sea strait near Istanbul. But step 2 changes everything. The Russian public found out and was outraged that their government would just abandon their Slavic brothers in Bosnia. So, step 3, bending to all that public pressure, the Russian government completely flip-flops and decides to back Serbia instead. Suddenly, everyone panicked. Everybody started calling in favors. Austria asked Germany, hey, if we attack Serbia and Russia interferes, will you help us out? Germany said yes. Russia then asked France for help, and while France was kind of hesitant at first, they eventually joined Britain and Russia to form the Triple Entente. On the opposing side, Germany and Austria-Hungary formed the Triple Alliance. And just like that, the continent was cleanly split into 2 massive, heavily armed opposing forces.
Now, what is truly staggering here is the personal dynamic behind these giant alliances. The leaders of these opposing sides, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, and King George V of Britain, they were literally first cousins. Let that sink in. This was a bloody family feud being played out with millions of innocent lives hanging in the balance. Moving on to Section 3, building the dynamite. So what actually made up the explosive material of our dynamite mountain? First up was nationalism. And we're not just talking about a healthy love for your country. This was an incredibly aggressive mindset. It was the absolute belief that your race or country was superior to everyone else. And it was used heavily by monarchs to convince their citizens that dying in battle was some glorious, heroic endeavor. But why did the monarchs even want war? Well, because of the second piece of dynamite, imperialism. That nationalist pride was largely just a very convenient cover story for imperialism. In plain terms, imperialism was about looting. These empires were constantly trying to capture more land globally so they could brutally exploit raw materials and cheap labor for their own profit.
And when you're looting the globe, you really have to protect your stolen wealth from other empires trying to do the exact same thing, which brings us to this staggering multiplier. Between 1870 and 1914, the six great powers in Europe quadrupled their military spending.
This massive forex increase was militarism in action. It meant rapidly expanding armies and navies. Think of Britain using its massive Royal Navy to maintain its global grip. And a really dark reality of this militarism was utilizing colonized subjects entirely as resources. This is exactly why millions of Indian soldiers, people living thousands of miles away, ended up fighting and dying for the British crown in a European war. They were simply treated as military assets for the empire. Section 4. The human cost. Let's look at whether the people actually wanted this war. The answer? Mostly no. On one hand, government propaganda was churning out these images of soldiers as disciplined heroes in noble service. But the reality? Many were just poor, unemployed men who desperately needed a job to survive, and they were heavily manipulated into stepping into those trenches. While some propaganda glorified things like the charge of the Light Brigade, others actually saw right through the lies. Poets like Wilfred Owen and Thomas Hardy, they exposed this brutal reality of the trenches. They wrote about the absolute horrors of poisonous gas and wounded limbs. But most importantly, they realized that the enemy's soldier across the trench was usually a poor man just like them. A man who, if they had met in a cafe instead of a war zone, would likely have been a friend. And this shared humanity, it brilliantly shone through during the famous 1914 Christmas truce. It is such a stunning piece of history. Right there, on the battlefield, German and British soldiers simply stopped fighting. They stepped out of their trenches, sang carols together, and even exchanged food. Face to face, they realized they had absolutely no personal reason to hate or kill each other. But of course, the systemic machine of war, that massive mountain of dynamite we talked about, wouldn't allow peace. The military commanders quickly intervened. They stepped in and bluntly threatened to shoot any of their own soldiers who refused to go back to the slaughter. The empires demanded blood, completely regardless of what the common man wanted. So the crucial point we need to take away is this. World War I was never, ever just about a single bullet fired in Sarajevo. It was the inevitable explosion of a perfect storm. It was the culmination of greedy monarchs, aggressive nationalism, and a global system of systemic looting. The dynamite had been building for decades. The matchstick just finally found the fuse. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you to ponder this. Think about this mountain of dynamite. What exactly happens when global powers prioritize endless expansion and military might over basic human life? Well, the answer costs the world 20 million lives. Thank you so much for joining me today. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you in our next explainer.